Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, this is the first full day of President Trump's second term in office as the 47th president. He is calling for the mass deportation of illegal immigrants, imposing tariffs on foreign imports, increased drilling for American gas and oil, and pardoning the January 6th protesters, among other things. And that's just in the first couple of days in office. What can you expect in the first 100 days, let alone the next 4 years? How different will this second term be compared to his first? And what will history say about Trump's second historic presidential election victory and the MAGA movement? Well, we have two local political scientists to weigh in on all of it. But first, we have viewer feedback from last week's show when we discuss potential changes to the way businesses will have to pay workers for minimum wage, paid sick time, and tipped wages. Changes that could go into effect in a couple of weeks unless state lawmakers take action.
The people I've talked to, most of them say they don't tip at fast food, and because they make minimum wage anyhow. And if this goes through, they said they probably won't tip at the restaurants, and they might even stop going. They'll go a whole lot less because wages will go up. I think it's going to be really, really hard on that industry. Especially the small ones.
Well, thanks for your call. Much appreciated. We'd like to hear from more of you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook. You can email us. You can dial into our follow-up hotline, as that viewer just did, to suggest future show topics or voice your opinion. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this season, you can log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Now on for tonight's show and tonight's guests, we have Dr. Kyla Stepp, an associate professor in the School of Politics, Society, Justice, and Public Service from Central Michigan University, and Dr. Kevin Lorentz, the second associate professor for the Department of Political Science, Saginaw Valley State University. They're both dialing in virtually, as you can see, and so am I. As viewers are probably surprised by that, because normally I'm in studio, but I was kind of under the weather throughout the day and decided to dial in. So maybe next week I'll be back in the studio because I'm feeling a lot better, so thank you. Nice to see you both. Hey, President Trump is calling his second term presidential win the greatest comeback in American political history. It's hard to argue in some ways, given he's the only second president to win 2 terms, but not consecutive. He survived assassination attempt. The rival party made things very hard for him during his first 4 years. And these past 4 years, he was in a courtroom more often than campaigning, charged with a multitude of alleged crimes, and convicted of a felony. And yet, despite it all, he won the popular vote, and a majority of Americans surveyed in recent days, 58% believe he'll do a good job. So can you two sort of describe a little bit what happened, how it happened, how he was been able to kind of just play over this over the last how many years? How has he been able to pull it off? Kevin, you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, I think that it's a testament in some respects to the ability of his campaigning, his ability to persuade. I think also this last election was quite unprecedented in terms of that we had an incumbent president who was, initially said he was going to run for re-election, and then, was essentially forced out by his own party to, not run for re-election. And that did quite a number in terms of helping. I think that it ultimately helped the Republican side somewhat on that. I think there is something to also be said that, and the political science literature would suggest that if we think about, retrospective voting in the sense of voters look back, how, the last 4 years, how were you compared to 4 years ago and so forth. And in particular, it's even more narrowed window, how do you feel in the last, 3, 4, 6 months. And so, despite there being a lot of, economic indicators that the economy, is firing on all pistons and everything, that didn't necessarily trickle down to, kitchen tables, if you will. And perception matters quite a bit too, of how people perceive. And inflation, is high and has quite a negative impact. And so there were a lot of variables, frankly, that were going well. In terms of going well for an opponent, for somebody trying to unseat an incumbent, despite him also having, Trump having significant barriers, bulwarks to overcome, and he did.
Yeah, Kyle, I don't know if you can follow up with some of that. I mean, I'm thinking about this MAGA movement, which was quite a movement over the last 8 years, and it continues to be strong and growing. That certainly has been a part of his base, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if anything, his loss 4 years ago helped energize his base. Certainly, there was all the allegations the election was stolen. January 6th, after everything that happened, people have been waiting for the next opportunity to kind of reelect him, to right the wrongs of him not being elected in 2020. And so I think, yeah, they've stayed strong. They've bided their time. And in the meantime, as Kevin said, and I completely agree with, the economic factors really worked in Trump's favor. It's the economy, stupid. That's
Right.
It's saying for a reason. And because at the end of the day, how do people vote? Based on their day-to-day lives. And that's just what it came down to in this election. In addition to, again, I agree, solid campaigning on part of his team, playing to people's emotions, fears, economic woes, all of that.
Yeah. And, we had our first part of our discussions kind of looking at the past, the election, and how they pulled it off. Now let's talk about this week. The inauguration was just yesterday. I know we plan to talk about kind of the first 100 days seems critical in any new administrations and the importance of that, but and what to expect. But based on the first day on the job yesterday, he was already shaking it up. And we know kind of what his priorities are going to be. I mean, he signed 190 executive orders yesterday. That's unheard of. What do you guys make of that? Kyla, you want to take a piece of that?
Sure. I mean, I think in part we saw this coming. He's made these campaign promises that day one he would do, A, B, and C. He's been saying that all along. Day one, I'll do this. Day one, I'll do that. On the other hand, it's still kind of surprising to see the breadth of actions he took on that first day. Some didn't even wait till the second day, his first full day in office, which was today. I mean, he was there signing executive orders and presidential proclamations and a wide array of issues. Again, not wasting no time to get this stuff done. So in a way, I think it was surprising. Some of the actions he took were a little bit more broad sweeping than I think people expected, like the pardons of the January 6th defendants. So I think it was both expected and surprising in a way.
Yeah. Kevin, before the show, we talked a little bit about, the amount of these executive orders, and I'm kind of blown away. I haven't seen the list. I don't know who's seen it, but not all of these executive orders are monumental, right? Some, I think you referred to it as sort of benign. So maybe you can elaborate on that, right?
Sure. Executive orders, the benign ones that I was referring to are kind of the orders that the president directs, like federal agencies, to carry out a law, to carry out a directive, to direct the military to, conduct an operation or what have you. Executive orders in the basic sense are just how the president executes the laws, and so forth. But the ones that often take people's breath away, as Kyla noted, like the breadth of them and so forth, are often the ones that seem to like run against, contrary to law, contrary to constitutional practice, contrary to, or in some instances seem to pronounce law, make law where there is no congressional statute or a statement, if you will. And it's those kinds of executive orders that tend to grab people's attention. And when people are referring to, executive orders, those are the kinds that they tend to refer to. And, already out of the gate, we have several of them that are being challenged. I think it was actually interesting, not just I agree with Kyla, like the breadth of them was quite interesting, and the volume also. But I think it's also interesting that several of them are splitting his own party, in the sense that Republicans have also kind of been taken aback at some of them. The pardoning of the January 6th rioters, for instance, is a good example. There have been several Republican senators and members of the House that have said opposed to that. And apparently contradicts what Vice President Vance had indicated too a few days prior. So, and I would expect to see more of that too, as like you said, there's so many, as the dust continues to settle and as we start to see these go into effect in the next 30 to 90 days. That'll be really interesting too.
Yeah, and on the other side, you're talking about President Biden that pardoned the January 6th committee, and he pardoned some members of his family. So that's sort of the other side. But yeah, in terms of 1,500 or 1,600 of the January 6th protesters, including many that did violent acts against police officers and others. And as you said, I mean, his own vice president and the new attorney general nominee, Bondi, disagreed, and some others. So we'll see how that shakes down, if there's anything they can do about that, right, at this point, once he's done it. But that remains to be seen. So to me, when I think about the executive orders, he completely, trashed the last 4 years of the Biden administration. I mean, not that he hasn't sort of been doing that all along, but I just can't imagine how uncomfortable. I mean, Biden's there behind President Trump when he's making his inaugural speech, Kamala Harris in there, and he's just, but maybe that's just politics. So he called on a national emergency at the border. So he's closing the borders, ending catch and release, among a litany of things that he's going to do in regards to immigration. Another executive order in terms of a national emergency was drill, baby, drill, drilling for gas and oil. He wants to recharge our energy resources, ending mandates on electric vehicles, ending the DEI movement, and declaring that there are only two kinds of people, male and female. So there's many more, but those are just sort of the highlights. So which of those do you have sort of maybe the biggest concerns with? Which ones do you think he's going to face the biggest pushback? Either one of you want to touch that?
Yeah, I'll go first. So there's a few there, and as we've mentioned a few times, presidents are pretty unlimited in the executive orders that they can give. It's only when that executive order comes up against the Constitution or a law that there's going to be an issue. So several of these executive orders, many of them, including the ones you mentioned, may have pushback, but they're not going to be overturned in the sense of a court saying, no, you can't do that. On the other hand, others of them have already, as Kevin mentioned, already been challenged, right? Trump, in his inauguration speech, mentioned again that he wants to end birthright citizenship. He passed, or I should say, he signed an executive order that essentially tries to do that. But that's one of those issues that it's a constitutional issue. The courts are going to have to weigh in. The Supreme Court already did weigh in over 100 years ago to say that if you're born here, you're a citizen. So
Right.
the Supreme Court would have to overturn itself in order to uphold that executive order. So that's just one example of something that is, faces challenges. It's already starting its way through the courts. We'll see if it gets to the Supreme Court or not. But that's one of many that I think not only is going to face challenges, but could get pushback from a number of people as well.
Kevin, do you have anything there along that note?
I'm really interested in watching, and I agree with what Kyla said, everything that she said. In addition to the birthright citizenship one, I'm really interested on the immigration orders, because this is it's a perennial issue almost in American politics, really, since the second Bush administration, and it has been much like Afghanistan is the vanquisher of empires. Immigration appears to be the vanquisher of many presidencies, and so and Congress's inaction on it. It was pretty interesting last year, where Congress looked like it was ready to pass a comprehensive border security bill that had broad bipartisan support. Biden was going to sign it, and then it was tanked largely because of Trump coming out against it. And so it's interesting to see how there are several measures that were in that bill that are included here in his executive orders. But of course, he goes above and beyond that as well. So I'm really interested to see how this is going to play out, not just in the courts, and if it runs up against, and it does. Many of these orders run up against established laws. international treaty obligations and so forth. But I'm really interested to see how it plays. It's quite clear from exit polling and polling post-election that immigration is a top priority. Americans across the board are concerned about what's going on with immigration, and it's reached a fever pitch.
On the transgender issues, he was actually chastised in church today. He and the First Lady went to a prayer service, and the minister from the pulpit chastised him for his comments on that. I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see some pushback on that issue. What are your thoughts? Either one of you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that, when Biden instituted allowing transgender individuals to serve in the military, I mean, since then, there have been thousands, right? There are thousands and thousands of transgender individuals currently serving in the military. That, in addition to Trump's proclamation of only two genders, I think you are going to get some pushback on both those issues, both from members of the military. I've heard as well saying, well, what do we do? Kick out thousands of people tomorrow, right? So there's kind of practical issues, as well as some of the more philosophical issues. And certainly, yes, we've already seen some pushback against both of those.
Yeah. Kevin, got anything on that issue at all? If not, I can move on.
Agree. I agree. I think it's going to be there's going to be significant pushback from multiple. And I think also, to underscore what Kyla said about logistical issues, I think that that's a common theme on many of these executive orders, frankly, is, it's one thing to say, like, deport everybody that's not here legally. And logistically, how do you do that? And I think that that's where, if anything, like perhaps Trump 1.0 didn't necessarily appreciate the logistics of that. It does seem, at least somewhat, that they are, in the sense that some of these executive orders are asking for studies or asking for a plan and so forth, that they seem to have learned that mistake, or like trying to remedy that mistake last time. But again, like, the logistical challenges seem to still be underestimated.
Yeah, you mentioned Trump 1.0, right? So, and this is an obvious question to ask you two, is that, do you see Trump in this second term being largely different than the Trump in the first term, as you said, the 1.0? Is it too early to say that? Do you think he's softened a lot? He still kind of runs his mouth, but because of what he learned in those first 4 years, I hear that a lot. And then he was out for 4, and now he's come back, and I assume he knows a lot more. It's too early to say whether or not he's going to tone down the rhetoric or work in a bipartisan way more than he did in that first term.
I'll take that one.
Okay.
I think on the one hand, like, and some of the reporting that was coming out today, suggesting that multiple career diplomats in the State Department have been asked to resign and have left. There seems to be additional resignations that are happening. The reassignment of certain individuals outside of what they're working in right now. And so, on the one hand, I think that I expect that they are going to be prioritizing more along the lines of, they're saying loyalty, or that's what critics have alleged, like, it's a loyalty purge, essentially. Like, you got to be loyal to the president's cause. But I also think that they're being cognizant of the fact that the executive bureaucracy, like, having people on the ground and being able to implement your vision is important. So I think that on the one hand, they're going to really try to be very cognizant of the fact of who is in those offices and who's considered a political appointee versus a career civil servant. I also think that there will be, in one respect, I think that he has control of Congress, if in the sense that, Republicans have control of Congress, but it's a different dynamic than his first, in his first term, when he did have unified control for the first 2 years, in the sense that the House is even more divided, frankly. And so I think that during his legislative meeting with the Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House today, that in the conversation, essentially, like, the pathway forward is whatever gets passed through the House. And so that's just, I think in some respects, they're going to be more cognizant of that and try. in some ways maybe rely more on House leadership or congressional leadership to spearhead things through. But then again, he's also demonstrated that, and I don't see any reason that this would be changed, that he is his own person.
Yeah.
And like he likes being his own general in many respects. And so I do wonder, it's very early. So I do wonder if there's any lessons learned or tactics changed.
Well, Kayla, I could probably follow up with you on that, but as Kevin was talking, I mean, again, we've got the GOP majority in the House and the Senate. He certainly has, in terms of the Supreme Court, I mean, he appointed 3 of them in his last administration, so they tend to lean conservative. I think that, America's kind of watching what they do in that first 100 days. They're going to have to get some quick wins, and then alongside that, how quickly can he confirm some of his cabinet nominees? And he has talked about recess nominations, and so I don't know if either one of you want to tackle that in terms of sort of getting quick wins, and if he's going to have to do something else to get these appointments across the finish line.
Sure. So basically, as we know, he's had some issues with some of his nominees. Certainly, there was the debacle with Matt Gaetz, who had to eventually withdraw. But there are some other nominees that are having kind of a tricky time with the Senate and may, in fact, not be confirmed. So what President Trump has been floating is this idea of recess appointments. So basically, if Congress is in recess, if the Senate is in recess, then the president is allowed to appoint these people to positions with vacancies on an interim basis. The president can appoint whoever he wants. It doesn't have to be approved by the Senate at that time. Then the person would serve in an interim role until at some point the Senate would have to vote on them. But at that point, typically those who are serving the interim role stay on. It's different than the process of confirming someone in the first place. However, whether all Republicans in the Senate would get on board with that is another matter. Many have indicated that they wouldn't do that because that would be kind of shirking their responsibility in a way, including John Thune, who is the majority leader in the Senate. So we'll see. It seems unlikely, but it's certainly something that Trump has floated and something that he could try to put into action if it looks like he's going to have a hard time getting some of his more controversial nominees confirmed.
Right. So is that common practice for presidents to use recess appointments, and at which point do they use that, when they feel like they've exhausted every other effort and they're just going to, this is the person I want in and this is what we're going to do, sort of circumventing the process a little bit, Kevin?
The recess appointments have been around for a while.
Okay.
Like, that's nothing new. The nature of recess appointments of becoming a little bit more political, like trying to circumvent, especially if you're facing a recalcitrant Senate. And so that's a more recent development, really becoming another example of like the pitched partisan battles between the parties. So the Obama administration since, and certainly in Trump 1.0, they face this problem. And in some ways, I think that it's Americans. I mean, there's 2 ways to look at that. You could look at this of a partisan, in one respect, a partisan Senate that's trying to, not work with a presidential administration that just won election. Of course, it's a co-partisan Senate, so that adds a little level of palace intrigue. But you could also look at it from the perspective of like, it's the separation of powers. Like, you're talking about 2 co-equal branches, so Congress on the one hand and the president on the other, and the
Right.
Senate has its own duty, as Kyla noted. And several of senators, moderate Republicans especially, do take that serious. And so, yeah.
Well, speaking of separation of powers, in the few minutes we have, I want to touch on this TikTok issue. The president here yesterday claimed he successfully restored the social platform TikTok after it was banned for a day. Both Congress approved the ban, Supreme Court approved the ban, saying it was a threat to national security. Does President Trump, can he really do that in the separation of church and powers, saying, hey, well, it's not an executive order, it's just I'm going to do something differently and kind of circumvent that separation of powers? Any thoughts on that, and whether or not, or was that just sort of grandstanding that that's what he wants to do and appealing to the 180 million people in America that use TikTok?
I mean, I think part of it, yes, definitely was. I mean, if you read the message that came up on TikTok when it went black, it was, we're down for now, but luckily President Trump is going to bring us back. And then the next day when it came back, it said, President Trump has brought us back, in so many words. So that was certainly part of it. You know, the CEO of TikTok was at the inauguration, has met with Trump on numerous occasions. On the other hand, Trump has promised that he would put in effect a 90-day extension on the ban, which the president does have the right to do under the law, but only if there's some sort of good faith showing that a sale is in progress, that there has been a buyer and the offer has been accepted. There has to be paperwork to this effect. None of that has happened. So if Trump is to institute that 90-day extension, I can imagine it will be challenged very quickly, because that is not following the letter of the law that was just passed, a few months ago through Congress, overwhelmingly passed through Congress and signed by the president. So we'll see what happens, but no, Trump can't just kind of unilaterally save TikTok. That would have to be something that Congress gets on board with too.
Sure. Kevin, if you can follow up on that, or if you've got something else that says, hey, this is something I want to kind of wrap up our conversation on Trump and the second administration, and thoughts that you have here.
I mean, I agree with Kyla's point about like he can't do what he's alleging. I think it's interesting too that that's another example of a executive order or an executive action that is actually dividing his own party. There were, as Kyla noted, like this ban passed with wide majorities, and so several Republicans actually decreed the move yesterday, and saying like, no, you can't. It's banned, and so. I think that's maybe. I mean, I don't like making predictions. Political scientists are notoriously bad at that.
Safe, right?
So, but I would say, like, given what we've seen thus far, one thing that I'm going to be watching, or I would be really interested to see, at least for the first 100 days of Trump 2.0, is going to be. I don't think it's going to be necessarily Democrats, the other, partisan group that's going to be the problem for his agenda. It's actually going to be his own party, particularly House Republicans, and whether or not they can get through with their razor-thin majority, if they can, what they can accomplish and what is possible. That just amplifies, anybody who objects is, it's one thing if you have a majority of 20 and one person objects, okay, we still have 19. But if you have to rely on, if only one, two, you can lose two people and then you have to rely on the other party. Well, it really gives an oversized power to those holdouts in your party. And I think in a way also it shows that to treat Republicans as a monolith is kind of incorrect, because there's quite a few Republicans that are not.
Right. Well, Dr. Kevin Lorentz from SVSU and Dr. Kyla Stepp from Central Michigan. Great conversation. Thanks for joining us on the follow-up tonight. And that is our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week for the follow-up with all the quick fix new weight loss drugs like Wegovy, Ozempic, and Mounjaro. We'll discuss the pros and cons of that next week. And you can also submit some questions online, questions that I can ask of the doctors and the guests next week. So see you next week, and thanks for joining us. Have a great night. Well, welcome to the follow-up after show. Of course, I'm Mike Redford, and I'm going to continue the conversation with our guests in the live show who joined us virtually, and they're staying on for a few more minutes. Dr. Kyla Stepp, Associate Professor, School of Politics, Society, Justice, and Public Service at Central Michigan University, and Dr. Kevin Lorentz, II, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Saginaw Valley State University. They're virtual, and I'm virtual as well. To be totally transparent, I wasn't feeling well earlier today, so I thought it was best to stay home and dial in, and so far, so good. A couple of things we didn't talk about when we think about the Trump inauguration, his second term. Kyle, has to do with the the World Health Organization, and I understand that President Trump said we're pulling out. What do you make of that?
So, certainly Trump has been critical of the World Health Organization for a while, ramped up certainly after the COVID-19 kind of pandemic towards the end of his presidency there. So while he's been critical of it for a while, it was a bit surprising on the very first day that was one of kind of the top priorities of him and his administration, was to say, we're done. We're pulling out of the World Health Organization and due to their ineptitude in handling the COVID-19 pandemic, was his statement. So Whether we can fully withdraw or whether that just signals his administration's intention to kind of ignore the WHO is another matter. We'll have to see exactly what he intends and whether this is going to be a court battle, whether this is something that needs congressional approval or not.
Right.
So that needs to be seen. But he has certainly signaled right out of the gate that we're no longer part of the WHO. So we'll have to see where we go from here.
Yeah, and he's been unhappy too with the European Union, in that they aren't pulling up their pocketbooks as much to support Ukraine in their battle against Russia. And maybe this has something to do with it as well. He's not happy with the World Health Organization. He's not happy with the European Union, and maybe he's just having decided, listen, we shouldn't be part of this at all. Let's just go on our own and run things the way we should do it. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, you're right. It's kind of America first mentality, right? Kind of along those same lines. We can do it better, so we're going to do it on our own to show that we can do it better. So, yeah, I mean, we'll kind of see how that proceeds. He did promise to end the war in Ukraine within his first few days in office. So we'll see kind of what he has planned for that. I don't know what that looks like, but that's another thing to look out for in the next, beginning of his presidency too.
And he's taking credit for the ceasefire in Gaza, Israel, over there as well, which I know he had a guy involved in the negotiations, and at the last minute, it seemed to make a difference. Another thing we didn't talk about, and maybe it's worth talking about, he's talking about tariffs on imports into our country to hit China, Mexico, Canada pretty hard, as much as 25% tariffs. There's different schools of thought on that. Kevin, any thoughts on, is he grandstanding? Is it sort of just kind of a threat to do it? Or do you think he's going to do it? And then if he does, the impact on our economy, some things that can lead to higher costs here.
Sure. I mean, if he follows through with them, it's going to be it's going to hurt, and it's not just going to hurt the targeted countries. Because retaliatory tariffs are a real thing, and I think it's been interesting to see Canada's response actually in the lead up to this. In the sense of Justin Trudeau, who's on his way out too,
Right.
Recently convened last week, I believe, all the premiers of the provinces and so forth, and with the notable exception of Alberta, that's kind of sitting it out. All the rest of them across their political spectrum, liberal to conservative, NDP, and so forth, have all agreed kind of like a Canada first approach to this. Like, we're going to have to defend, Canadian interests, which is going to be really interesting. They're our largest trading partner. And so if we get into a war like this, like I would hope that the president realizes like that no one's going to win that. And I would hope that everyday Americans would also see that, like, that's going to trickle down. We're going to feel that. Now, to the question of, is it grand? I think in a way that he is definitely trying to make a point. In a way, it's trying to bully those nations into, and I should say, like, I almost leave China separate because China's got a whole nother set of factors involved here. But looking at Mexico and Canada, there seems to be that maybe this is a way for him in particular to use leverage to try to get them to cooperate on border security broadly. And in the case of Canada, I mean, it's quite obvious what the beef is, if you will, with the Mexican border. But for the Canadian border, it's been kind of porous in terms of fentanyl and other hard drugs coming in. But Canada has also been very vocal from a statistical standpoint of sharing, like, okay, well, here's the amount of fentanyl that's been seized at the border, and it amounts to, less than 1% of the grand total that's made it into the U.S. Mm-hmm. So again, why do you think this is a problem? So I see him more using it as a bargaining chip in some ways, or trying to hard diplomacy, bullying, whatever you want to call it, which is a similar fashion that I think what he's trying to do with Greenland and Panama to a point too. But yeah.
So Kyla, to wrap things up, I don't know if you have any more to say on the tariffs or anything else on the after show that's on your mind that you were just dying to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin brought up Greenland and Panama, and I think that's worth mentioning just here in the end, because certainly in the inauguration speech, Trump kind of doubled down once again that we are taking back the Panama Canal. Perhaps it'll be the America Canal instead. And I just find that interesting. It's not, something we can really do unless we want to start a war with Panama. So it's kind of interesting. We'll see how that plays out, as well as Greenland. I think the Panama Canal is one of his top priorities. He's made it seem that way anyway, and I don't think that's going to be quite as easy as he thinks. But maybe, yeah, this is an intimidation kind of tactic. Doesn't seem to be working so far in the president of Panama, but we will see. But it will be certainly interesting to see how that plays out.
It's gonna be an interesting. It's gonna be an interesting ride. We never did talk about how we changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and Denali in Alaska to renaming it Mount McKinley, but that's a discussion for another day. Thank you both for joining us on the follow-up and the after show. Great job, great discussion. Looking forward to doing it again down the road. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Mike.
You bet.
Thanks, Mike.
And thank you, our viewers, for joining us on the after show.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.